Okay, welcome back. Good to see you guys. Hopefully, you're having a good day so far whenever you're watching this. There's 10 minutes until the lecture period starts, and as I'm always usually doing, I'm starting the stream a bit early just to kind of give a margin of time. But welcome here, get comfortable, and in about 10 minutes, we'll get into our lecture for today. Hey, Santino, welcome back. Hey there, Justin. Good to see you too. Jennifer, welcome back too. Good to see you. Hey, Jasmine. Jimin, welcome back. Thanks again for being here. Okay, still got about 7.5 minutes till we start. Carson, hey there. Hello, everybody. Yes, definitely. Just clocking in a few minutes before 4. You know. Hey there, Jasmine. Jasmine P, Jasmine M. Welcome back, guys. So it's like another 6 minutes. Hey. Hey, Leanne. Hello again. Hey, Elena. Good to see you guys. Good to see you. Okay, so it's like another 4 minutes basically, and we're ready to roll. Nick, hey there. Give it that little bit of glare. Hey, Daniel. So just a couple more minutes. Natalia, welcome back. Good to see you there. Thank you guys for your attendance and everything. And we're getting down to just the last, minute and a half. I'm just waiting until 4, just to make sure we get nobody left behind if we start early. So. Oh, Peachy makes an appearance. Peachy sighting. Hey, Puria, Mary Jane. Welcome back, guys. Little Peachy. Okay. Nice. Welcome, everybody. We're almost ready to get started, so just give it a few seconds. All right, guys. So, and hey, Julian, welcome back as well to see you. Good to see everybody that's already here. Welcome back. So it's today, April 22nd. And first off, I hope you guys had a good weekend. To anybody celebrating it, I hope you had a nice Easter. And it's nice to be back with you guys as usual today for our Tuesday meeting this week. So we have a couple more lectures on the current unit of the course that we're working through, which is the whole animal ethics topic. Hi, Tyler, Zach, and everyone else. Welcome. Good to see you guys. So I'm going to start, as I often do, by just like summarizing the most important content from last time, and then we'll segue, make a smooth transition into the authors that are listed in the calendar for today's meeting. So, as you know, we've been examining these arguments that bear on the question of, do we have moral obligations to animals? Is there anything like morally problematic about our status quo that involves eating them or using them for medical experiments or for fur or leather or anything like that? Dairy, eggs, etc. Some people, I would say the vast majority of just everyday people, think that the traditional view is correct, which is that animals either have no moral status or at least a significantly different moral status than human beings. We regard each other as the holders of rights. We don't think it's okay to just attack other people, kill them, eat them, use them for our purposes, for our benefit in ways that harm or exploit them. But we're not really feeling the same way about animals for the most part because, of course, as we all know, we have practices that have been long socially instituted where we're eating them and doing things like that, placing them on factory farms. And of course, that causes them a lot of pain and suffering, things that we wouldn't be willing to do to humans for similar reasons. Do they have a moral standing that this is, that this violates? One author was Singer. He thinks that animals should be treated equal when they have the same interests as us. Those same interests should be given the same respect or consideration. So since they can feel pain and so can we know that we're interested in avoiding pain and suffering. He thinks that we should extend the same kind of consideration to the animal's interest in the same. That does not amount to having the same exact rights because animals can't be interested in some of the things that we have rights to, whether that's voting, practicing whatever religion, marrying whoever you want. Those just don't apply to animals because they can't comprehend the topic of those things that are of interest to us. But when they are interested in avoiding pain, he says that's on par with our own, so we should show the same consideration to it. After him, we started talking about Tom Regan. That was our last author that we were speaking about on Thursday. So I do want to just give you the breakdown of the major points that he covered and maybe ask if some of you can just kind of provide your own memories or recollections of it. So Tom Regan wrote the paper called The Case for Animal Rights. And he has a kind of bold position. He goes even farther than Singer, really, because he's not even just a utilitarian that says the pleasure and the pain of the animal matters and it should be placed on the scales of pain and pleasure that determine what's right or wrong to do. He says that we should regard the animals as having full-on rights. And if you have rights take priority over utility. So if there's a right that could be violated, but it could generate a lot of pleasure or utility, then most people that believe in rights say that the right has to hold sway. That's the thing that has to be given respect. So he doesn't just think that it would be okay, as Singer does, to use animals that were not subjected to factory farm conditions or that were not made to suffer, humanely produced and slaughtered meat, or animals that were experimented on but didn't suffer excessively. This might bypass the requirements of Singer's moral argument, but to Regan, it's still not far enough because it's still treating them as though they're just resources to be exploited for human use. One of the major parts of Regan's argument is to outline, and welcome everybody that's arriving, great to see you guys. He mentioned two different types of value that a thing could have. Does anybody here in the chat, can the chat tell me what either of those two types of value were that he said beings could possess? You could have this type of value or that type of value. Let's see if anyone can just get that note either from their memory or written notes. Two types of value according to Mr. Tom Regan, and this helps to form a basis of his argument. And he's trying to argue that animals have one of these two types, but not the other, and that also we do. But there was, just to check in with you, what do you think I'm talking about? Okay, good. Instrumental and inherent value. Exactly. Thanks, Mary Jane. So about those two things. If something has just inherent value, if it has inherent value, that means that it's got a value in and of itself, regardless of what usefulness it could have to any other person or any other being. So If a thing has inherent value, it doesn't matter if it's making people happy. It doesn't matter if it's serving any practical purpose or utilitarian value. It's just valuable in and of itself, regardless of its usefulness to others. Instrumental value, though, is something that only has value as a means to be utilized for some other purpose by other people or other things. So like the marker that I'm writing with, that I sometimes write with, this would have only instrumental value because nobody thinks that the marker should be protected, cared for, prevented from destruction if it can't do anything practical or valuable to others like writing. If this thing can't write, it's going in the trash. And that's fine because it's only an instrument. It's just a tool to be used for whatever purpose. But if it can't serve that purpose or function, then it's useless. We are now asking the question, do animals, non-human animals, do they have just inherent value or instrumental value? The author argues that they have inherent value. That they have inherent value, which means they shouldn't only be considered as things to be used for food or for experiments or for clothing or whatever. They should only be respected in and of themselves, regardless of their utility to other things. So if a thing has inherent value, it has it equally to any other thing that has inherent value and should be given ultimate respect. He thinks that a lot of the abusive practices surrounding animals on factory farms and other abusive practices result from the general assumption that animals are just tools to be used by mankind for whatever purposes that advance our interests at their expense. But if they have inherent value, then that would be considered wrong. Now, why do they have inherent value? What is the reason that the author said that they're the holders of rights and inherent value? He says it's predicated on a certain attribute of the things that have inherent value. Why is it? What is it that makes something have inherent value to him that both people, human beings, and non-human animals also can have the same attribute? That we're all different. So it's not based on having intelligence. It's not based on being able to use language. What is that key factor that Regan said qualifies something to be a holder of inherent value and a member of the moral community with rights? It's just got to be a thing that what? I don't know if you remember the phrase, but I just wanted to tap into this little part of his argument. So he says the animals have inherent value, but based on the reason what? Because they are what kind of things or what property, attribute, feature is it of them that places them within that realm of having inherent value? No, not to worry, Mary Jane. I do appreciate your contributions. And to the others, I hope that you all can at least remember, or I know it's been a long weekend, with a holiday, but it was that point that they're the subjects of a life, okay? Subjects of a life. It's that baseline requirement that he thinks makes something a member of the moral community. So to be the subject of a life just means having consciousness, being able to feel things, and having a basic interest in your own life and well-being. So animals certainly have that. They may not be able to read, they may not be able to write, they can't talk, they can't, take notes for a philosophy lecture or even, do any of the other important things that humans are having a more advanced intellect are capable of doing. But it doesn't matter, says Regan. They're just subjects of a life. They have consciousness, they have the ability to feel pleasure and pain, and they take an interest in their own lives and well-being. So if you're the subject of a life, he says, boom, that's it. You're a thing that has inherent value and you should be respected as such. He really wants to insist that it's not based on any other criteria like language use, higher thought, or some of the other things that are often listed in connection with trying to encircle only humans within the moral community. He also then tries to respond to a number of reasons that those which deny animals have rights would have made. Like, what is the reason that the deniers of animal rights would deny that they have those same rights? Some people think that that we can only have indirect duties to them, something that we'll circle back to today as we focus more on Kant's writings, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher. Some say they only have indirect value because, like, for example, if I break the windshield on your car, I'm not doing a disservice to the windshield because it can't think, it can't feel, it's just an inanimate object. But of course, indirectly, I have a duty not to do that, not for the sake of the windshield, but for the sake of the owner of the car. So you might say, I have an indirect duty to be not harmful and etc. to pet animals and so on because they belong to a person. And then that means that the person is the one that I have to show respect for in terms of not doing harm to their animals. But he doesn't agree with that. He says, why should we think animals only are the holders of indirect value or that we only have indirect duties to them? they're certainly not exactly like a windshield because they can feel and they can perceive and they can sense pain and pleasure. So he finds that to be an illegitimate basis. He also says that if you try to discount the importance of their pain, he doesn't see that as a valid objection either, because pain is bad no matter who has it or what has it. So he thinks that that's also unprincipled. He says some people will try to argue that it's based on the contractarian idea. So animals don't have rights because they can't engage in contracts. They can't like sign on the dotted line, understand what they're agreeing to, and then be held accountable to the terms of the contract later. Some people think that morality and ethics is just a sort of very sophisticated form of contracts that are implicitly agreed to by the different members of the moral community. But if you can't engage in contracts because you don't have the type of brain that's necessary to understand such things, then that might be the thing that disqualifies you from having rights. But here again, Regan doesn't agree with that. He says the contractarian approach is bad and wrong because it could also exclude from the moral community certain humans even. What kind of humans? Humans with like severe cognitive or mental disabilities that are of low mental function. If they couldn't read or they were not verbal or they didn't understand such things as contracts, we would certainly not say, well, that makes them fair game to be used as instruments for the purposes of the other human beings that have those higher capacities. So he says the contractarian view, it attempts to just exclude animals, but unfortunately for that argument, it also would, to be consistent, exclude similar humans that also lack the same intellectual capacities, which most would find wrong. In view of the more sophisticated contractarian sub-argument that John Rawls provides about the veil of ignorance, some people say that if we had a system of creating rules for society where people that were making the rules were denied all information about their identities, like their age, gender, income level, socioeconomic status, race, if they didn't have access to those facts about themselves, then they would surely make fair rules because they'd be concerned that if they didn't do so, like if they discriminated against a certain class of persons in their instituted rules, then that might disadvantage them if when the veil was removed, they found out that they were, like, for example, one of those people that they marginalized in the rules that were written. But this, again, doesn't really bypass Regan's critique anyway, or at least he doesn't think so, because he says even according to a sophisticated contractarian view where people had the veil of ignorance, they would have at least enough information to know that they were rational. And so they could still decide on rules that would exclude from moral consideration non-rational animals and low cognitive function humans, which again seems to him to be wrong. He also talks briefly about the cruelty-kindness view. Some people think that's why animals, they don't really have rights, but we should at least be kind to them and not unnecessarily cruel. Does that spell out our moral obligations? Somewhat short of rights, but just a requirement to be generally kind and not cruel. He also thinks this doesn't go far enough because just being kind doesn't ensure that everything you're doing is morally good, because there could be a kind person that's like a racist or whatever. And he also says that avoiding cruelty doesn't necessarily ensure that whatever you're doing is not bad. A person could provide a humane, like euthanization of a person that they didn't request, like in the middle of the night, to avoid cruelty to the person so that they wouldn't suffer or feel pain. But we would still think that that would be wrong. So he doesn't think that reaches far enough to set the moral foundation of a good argument here either. Finally, he turns his aim at utilitarianism itself. Some people, even Singer, who's a pro-animal author, believe that we don't necessarily need to affirm that animals have rights. We just have to say that they can feel pleasure and pain. And if we take account of their ability to feel pleasure and pain in the way that we deal with them, then that would satisfy our moral obligations concerning them. But Regan also finds utilitarianism at its core to be a problematic moral theory. And that's kind of what I was talking about as we ran out of time on Thursday. On the one hand, he says utilitarianism is problematic because it cannot absolutely guarantee proper treatment of our fellow humans. As an example, he gives the case of Aunt B. Aunt B is just a made-up character to make a point, but suppose that this woman is somebody's aunt and she's not well-liked, she's nasty, antagonistic, just bitter, etc. But she has a lot of money, and she has a nephew who, in her current version of the will, that money would be transferred to him as a result of if she were to die. But she's thinking of changing the will, let's suppose, in the next 2 weeks. So suppose that the nephew killed her and thus inherited the money before she changes the will. And then he was deciding to do something really nice for human beings with the money, like maybe set up a children's hospital or send it off to cancer research or, whatever, something that would create a whole bunch of happiness in the world. most of us would think it would be wrong, right, to kill Aunt B simply because if she were to die, more total happiness in the world would exist than what would exist if she were permitted to continue living. This shows again that when we talk about this character of Aunt B, and you just think about it in common sense terms, you probably would come to the conclusion that she has inherent moral value. She's not only valuable to whatever degree that she makes other people happy or she satisfies their desires. She's just a human being. She's the subject of a life. So shouldn't she have a right to be alive, even if by killing her or ending her life, more total happiness would spill over as a result? He also gives another analogy along the same lines to make this similar point. He says, imagine that there were cups filled with liquid. The liquid can stand for the total amount of happiness, and the cup can stand for the person or being which holds the happiness within it. Now, suppose that if we broke one of these cups, but that caused other cups to increase their volume of liquid in such amount that would overwhelm the total amount that the one cup held. In the pure utilitarian sense, it seems like we ought to break the cup because all that's really cared about in utilitarian theory is the total amount of happiness that's generated by each action, not necessarily the people who are the beings capable of feeling pleasure and pain. So he thinks that it's the wrong prioritization in utilitarianism. It doesn't really place ultimate value on the people or the things that can feel pleasure and pain, but rather the feeling of pleasure itself. That's what is supposed to be maximized, even if it comes at the expense of, say, the lives of certain individuals. So he says the only real moral view that can accommodate our intuitions about what's right and wrong, not just for animals, but for people too, is a rights-based view. It's kind of like a quasi-Kantian view that Regan ends up expressing, because he thinks that, just as Kant said, you're never morally allowed to treat other human beings as a means to an end. He thinks the same should be true of our dealings with animals. It's not just humanity or rational beings that shouldn't be treated as a means to an end, but anything that's the subject of a life. He sees that view as attractive because, unlike contractarianism, it grants us rights in principle, not just if and only if we could enter into contracts, or if and only if we were promoting the happiness of other people or whatever. And hi there, Michelle and Amanda and others. Good to see you guys too. So he says we can't just limit rights only to humans to be morally consistent. Animals lack many traits that mature adult humans have. Yes, he acknowledges that. But so do many low intelligence or low cognitive functioning humans as well. In the case of the low functioning human, we don't usually see that as any basis to deny them equal rights or equal value. So he says what we should do in looking at our obligations to animals is consider the similarities that we have to them instead of the differences. It's the same as the way we look at the low cognitive functioning human beings. Suppose there's a human being with a mental disability that makes them intellectually incapable of forming a sentence or writing something down. If you thought that they have equal value to you, it's not because you're focusing so much on how you're different from them. Oh, I'm smarter than them, or I have more rational capacities than them. When you grant sympathy and include them in the moral community, you're focused more on what you have in common with them. And what is it that we have in common with people or human beings that have low cognitive functioning? Just that we're all living things, that we're all the experiencing subjects of a life. We're conscious, we're concerned with our own individual well-being in many ways. And that's something that we have in common, not just with the low intelligence humans, but also with animals. They, just as much as we, have full and equal rights and value according to Regan then. Saying only humans have such value forces you to point out some non-arbitrary difference between us and them, but for any such difference that you could cite or mention, there are going to be some humans at least that also lack those characteristics as well. Now, he also acknowledges one other small point. If you go far down enough on the phylogenetic tree of life and you're getting into like little, flies and, caterpillars and stuff, you might be able to find certain life forms that actually don't have enough experience to constitute being the subject of a life. But he says that's kind of irrelevant for the purposes of his argument, because what he's really focused most on are those beings that are a little higher up, chickens, pigs, cows, that certainly do have at least the capacity to feel things and to have conscious experiences. So with respect to those, he said they have rights, or at least they ought to be regarded as such. And that's kind of how he rests his case. Let me just read that a couple of words from him on that, and then we'll move on to the other authors for today. Regan says, the place to begin, I think, is with the utilitarian's view of the value of an individual or lack of value. In its place, suppose we consider that you and I, for example, do have value as individuals, what we can call inherent value. To say we have such value is to say that we are something more than, something different from mere containers of pleasure. Moreover, to ensure that we do not pave the way for such injustices as slavery or sexual discrimination, we must believe that all who have inherent value have it equally, regardless of their sex, race, religion, birthplace, and so on. Similarly, to be discarded as irrelevant are one's talents or skills, intelligence and wealth, personality or pathology, whether one is loved or admired, or despised and loathed. The genius and the mentally deficient child, the prince and the pauper, the brain surgeon and the fruit vendor, Mother Teresa and the most unscrupulous used car salesman all have inherent value, all possess it equally, and all have an equal right to be treated with respect. So he then says, the rights view, I believe, is rationally the most satisfactory moral theory. It surpasses all other theories in the degree to which it illuminates and explains the foundations of our duties to one another. But attempts to limit its scope to humans only can be shown to be rationally defective. Animals, it is true, lack many of the abilities humans possess. They can't read, do higher math, build a bookcase, make a baba ganoush. Some of these things are random. But neither can many human beings, however, and yet we don't say that they, the humans, are therefore things that have less inherent value or less of a right to be treated with respect than others. It's the similarities between those human beings who most clearly, non-controversially have such value, not our differences, that matter most. And the really crucial basic similarity is simply this: we are each of us the experiencing subject of a life, a conscious creature having an individual welfare that has importance to us, whatever our usefulness to others. We want and prefer things, believe and feel things, recall and expect things. All these dimensions of our life, including our pleasure and pain, enjoyment and suffering, satisfaction and frustration, continued existence, all make a difference to the quality of our life, as experienced by us as individuals. As the same is true of those animals that concern us, the ones that are eaten and trapped, for example, they too must be viewed as the experiencing subjects of a life with inherent value of their own. So that's basically it, I guess. Pretty much all I had to say to you guys. Just wanted to wrap up and summarize the last couple of things left in the Regan. But we've got more to say. So we're turning the page now to the more anti-animal side of the moral argument. We spent a good amount of time focused on, I guess, probably the less intuitive argument for many people first encountering the whole literature, because many people, of course, they have the established practice of eating meat or, using animal products. So it's probably easier, I should say a little bit harder for people to grapple with the arguments to the contrary, that there's something wrong with that. So that's what I wanted to focus on first. But now we're moving on to the defense of the status quo, arguments that say that actually, no, animals don't have rights, and whatever we're doing to them, whether it's food, clothing, biomedical experiments, it's fully justified and there's nothing wrong with it at all. So we need to get that balance. We're going to start off with one of those authors that are listed by the syllabus for today, and it's Carl Cohen. So Carl Cohen's paper that I'm just thumbing through the book to get there. This is called The Case for the Use of Animals in Biomedical Research. So here's another philosopher with a much different point of view and argument. Carl Cohen's paper was first published in 1986. So anyway, there's just the title and author information. Carl Cohen, again, his paper called The Case for the Use of Animals in Biomedical Research from 1986. So let's find out what this author's argument is and how he makes his distinct case. So he starts off the paper by saying that there's two major reasons that some give against using animals in biomedical experiments. So he wants to try and challenge both of those reasons, and I'm going to put them here in the chat. So first one, it violates their rights. And the second one, it imposes too much avoidable suffering. But those two arguments or views are things that he's going to try and discredit. Okay, so he's taking aim as his opponent, the person who thinks that if you are experimenting on animals or if these practices exist, that it's wrong because number one, it violates the rights of the animal that's being tested on, or number two, that it imposes just too much avoidable suffering on those animals. He tries to show that neither of those is true. So first off, he launches into the first major section of his paper, which is titled Why Animals Have No Rights. Why animals have no rights. So here's why he thinks animals don't have rights, because for him, what a right requires, or what it kind of amounts to, is the ability to make claims against another. So here's what he says, putting it in the chat. Okay, so what he says, and this is an interesting thing, he says rights are claims. Rights are claims that one party may exercise against another. So there are various different types of rights. We can have a right for repayment if I'm a lending institution or just an individual and I draw up a contract with another person that says you agree to repay this loan under a certain amount of, certain window of time. Then once you agree to that, I have a claim against you if you default on the loan and you don't pay it back. You see, at that point, I could say, well, I want to raise a claim against you for not having adhered to the letter of our contract or understanding. There could be rights to other things. There could be a right to non-discrimination. Suppose that you had amazing scores in high school, but then you applied to a certain college and they were admitting people with worse scores and worse SAT and grades than you, and they just said that they were doing that because they don't like your gender or your race. You'd think in that case that you'd have a fair argument to make in court that you've been discriminated against in either a racial or gender-based way, that they're using your gender or race against you as a disqualifying factor. And if you raise that claim, it could be adjudicated in court, it could be evaluated by jurists, and maybe your claim could be recognized and honored, and you'd have a successful case. But there has to be the at least ability to make these claims in a moral community, he says. To even be a holder of rights, you have to be the kind of thing that can recognize when there's been a violation of your rights, to raise the claim, and then to see if this will then be respected, honored, or turned in your favor. So he says, in order to have rights, you got to be able to make claims. You got to be able to make claims. And that's why he says animals don't have rights, because they just can't make claims. They can't understand what it would be that they would be claiming. They also can't evaluate the question that's raised by the claim. So to continue with my little note-taking here in the chat, therefore, based on what was written above, so what I just typed out is, so let me just retrace the reasoning. He says, animals don't have rights. Why? Because rights are claims that one moral agent can make against another, or that one party can make against another party. And if that's the case, if rights require the ability to make claims, then the only things that could possibly have rights would be things that are capable of making or responding to moral claims. If you steal something from me, I can raise a claim against you, file a police report, and maybe have you held accountable and have my property returned. An animal, though, has no ability to make a claim. It has no understanding of the reciprocity of rights and obligations. Having rights is also just half of what a moral agent is expected to abide by in a moral community. You have rights, but you also have obligations. So if you have a right to life, you kind of recognize that it's a two-way street, that you also have an obligation to the other members of the moral community not to take their lives, right? It's not like you just get rights, but you have no duties to anyone else. Since you have a right to life, you recognize that you have a corresponding obligation to other beings that are in the moral community to not terminate their life. But an animal can't possibly understand that subtle balance of rights and duties. If you say that the animal has a right to live, wouldn't it then have an obligation not to kill other things? But there's no way that it can recognize the duties that are being foisted upon it by the sophisticated moral agents that talk about the nexus of rights and obligations. So that's why he says they're locked outside of the moral community. They're beings that have consciousness. They can feel pleasure and pain. Sure, they can. They're subjects of life, to use Regan's terminology, but they can't make, nor can they understand, nor respond to moral claims of any type. So he says rights are not just things that we can throw out there to random beings. It's only assignable to a specific type of being, a being that can understand the concept of a right itself and the ability to raise a claim against the violation of a right. So rights are claims made in a community of moral agents. So the possessors of rights can only be beings capable of making moral claims, and that's humans. The relevant capacity that makes us capable of engaging in such claims has been described differently by different authors, but he gives us a sort of summation of some of those points here on page 589. Let me just read you some of his commentary, and then that'll bring us to where we're at right now in my description on the lecture. He says, a right, so why animals have no rights. A right properly understood is a claim or potential claim that one party may exercise against another. The target against whom such a claim may be registered could be a single person, a group, a community, or perhaps all humankind. So if one person stole from me, I can make a claim against that one person. If I was deprived of my rights by a company or something, then I could file a claim against that business. If it was a whole country, then I might raise a claim against the government of the United States or something. But in any case where I have rights, it corresponds to this capacity of making claims. Continuing, the content of rights claims also varies greatly: repayment of loans, non-discrimination by employers, non-interference by the state, and so on. To comprehend any genuine right fully, therefore, we must know who holds the right, against whom it is held, and to what it is a right. So he says, rights arise and can only be intelligibly defended among beings who actually do or can make moral claims against one another. Whatever else rights may be, they are therefore necessarily human. The possessors are necessarily persons. He continues, he says, the attributes of human beings from which this capacity arises have been described variously by philosophers, both ancient and modern. St. Augustine, the Christian philosopher of antiquity, he said that this capacity that gives us rights is the inner consciousness of free will. St. Thomas Aquinas said, the grasp by human reason of the binding character of moral law. Hegel, the German philosopher, said, the self-conscious participation of human beings in an ethical system. Bradley said, human membership in a moral community. Mead said, the development of the human self through the consciousness of other moral beings. Pritchard said, the underivative intuitive cognition of the rightness of an action. And most influential has been Kant's emphasis on the universal human possession of moral will and autonomy. So he then summarizes and says, humans confront choices that are purely moral. Humans, but not dogs or mice, lay down laws for others and for themselves. Human beings are therefore self-governing, morally self-legislative, morally autonomous. So, I mean, it is kind of interesting to consider that. When you look at the human realm and the human race, we've invented these very sophisticated systems of jurisprudence precisely to hold one another accountable for what we regard as violations of our duties to one another. So it's not like we just live in the jungle and we take as we see fit and might makes right. We have systems in place to protect the weak against the strong and to upstand and maintain our rights and the things that we value. So only in the human world, if I attack a person or assault them or steal from them, could I be expected potentially to be arrested, tried, and then punished by incarceration or by some other kind of social penalty. Animals, on the other hand, don't have systems of justice, jurisprudence, no recognition of obligations one to another. They sometimes act communally. They sometimes act in ways that are protected, particularly of their own offspring or members of their own, like, I guess, pack. But they don't have the highly attenuated, sophisticated systems of accountability that humans have developed. So they're not making moral claims to one another, and they're not holding one another accountable for the violation of any such claims. Therefore, he says, they're just self-evidently not things that have rights. Now, there's some objections to this, but again, just to emphasize and press the point again, animals lack the capacity for free moral judgment and making moral claims. So he says that means they don't have rights and they can't have rights. We can't violate rights that don't exist. So don't worry, he says, about the use to which we put animals in factory farms or in biomedical experiments in particular, given the title of his essay. Those things aren't wrong. They may be hurtful to the animals. They may be painful. They may kill the animals. but they don't have any rights anyway. They have no right to be alive or to be free of pain and suffering. If they were going to have rights, they would have to be these type of beings, once again, that could articulate, respond to, and engage in this moral claiming. Now, there is a possible objection to this. I'm sure some of you can probably think about it, and something that can connect us back to the writings of Regan that were just discussed. What do you think somebody might say that's on the opposite side of his viewpoint against this? That to have rights, you have to be able to make moral claims. Can you think of any kind of reason that that might seem problematic if it were applied consistently, say, to every member of the human race? Let's see if anybody here can catch the thought that I'm trying to convey. What is it then that what might be seen as a problem with the argument that to have rights, you got to be able to make moral claims, and that's what disqualifies the animals, because they can't do that? Think back to what Regan had argued, and maybe even Singer to some degree. If that's what it takes to have rights, what's the problem with that? Maybe. Someone could argue. Rights don't apply to you unless you can make moral claims. What reason could there be to say that that's not a good thing to argue, or what's morally wrong with saying that, or having that conclusion? Mary Jane, correct. Yes, some human beings also don't have the capacity to make moral claims. And that's also correct, Jennifer. Some humans who cannot do the same, which would exclude certain population like the disabled, mentally ill. Yes, not all people have that capacity, not all humans anyway. People versus human, again, we talked about that earlier with our abortion lectures. Subtle distinction. Probably human is a better term to use, because people sometimes carries with it an implication of like those higher intellectual capabilities. But yes, you're all correct. Human beings, not all of them can make moral claims either, or even understand them. There are some severely cognitively disabled individuals that wouldn't have those abilities either. Are we going to deny them rights on the same basis that he thinks that animals lack rights? So that's one objection. An objection to his view is that there's certain brain damaged or maybe mentally disabled people who also lack those abilities to make moral claims. How does he respond to that? He responds to that point in a way that was anticipated by Singer earlier. Remember when Singer went through objections to his argument and he said, well, when people try to compare the case of the mentally disabled human and the animal, they'll sometimes try to distinguish the two by saying, well, at least the mentally disabled human is a member of a rational species. So it's like their species membership that kind of gives them into the moral community instead of their individual possession of the typical rational abilities that most mature adult humans have. So he kind of replies with the whole they're of the rational kind thing, and that's the distinction that can be made between them, their case, and then the non-human animals that lack rationality as well. I don't know. I mean, Singer didn't like that response because he thought it sounds like we're judging now individuals based on group membership instead of individual characteristics, which invites kind of, I don't know, discrimination of various forms. But that's what Regan says. Sorry, I meant to say that's what Cohen says, current author. Let me read you his words about that point. He says, yeah, a common objection which deserves a response can be paraphrased as follows. If having rights requires being able to make moral claims, to grasp and apply moral laws, then many humans, the brain damaged, comatose, senile, who plainly lack those capacities must be without rights, but this is absurd. So he then says, this objection fails and mistakenly treats an essential feature of humanity as though it were a screen for sorting humans. The capacity for moral judgment that distinguishes humans from animals is not a test to be administered to human beings one-to-one, one by one. Persons who are unable, because of some disability, to perform the full moral functions natural to human beings are certainly not for that reason ejected from the moral community. The issue is one of kind. So there he says, humans are of such a kind that they may be the subject of experiments only with their voluntary consent. The choices they make freely must be respected. Animals are of such a kind that it is impossible for them in principle to give or withhold voluntary consent or to make a moral choice. What humans retain when disabled, animals have never had. So he's comfortable with that line of rebuttal to the whole, but what about the mentally disabled humans? You know, his view is they're still members of the human race, therefore they're the members of a kind of species that generally has rationality, and that's why they're not like the cow or pig, because the cow or pig lacks rationality, but that's not being a defective specimen of that species. That's typical and normal for their species, whereas in the human case, it's atypical. So it's still generally the kind of species that has those abilities of rationality and whatnot. Another objection would say that the animals actually can engage in reason, or that they can somehow communicate or express some version of rationality. And here again, Cohen just kind of denies that. He says, if they have any of these capacities, it's still not the same thing as being able to engage in moral judgment, to raise moral claims, and to be responsive to moral claims. That's what he says here on page 590. He says, the whole criticism misses the point. It's not the ability to communicate or reason or dependence on one another or care for the young or the exhibition of preference that marks the divide. Analogies between human families and those of monkeys or between human communities and those of wolves are entirely besides the point. Patterns of conduct are not the issue. Animals do indeed exhibit remarkable behavior at times, but membership in a community of moral agents still remains impossible for them. Beings subject to moral judgment must be capable of grasping the generality of an ethical premise in a practical syllogism. Humans act immorally often enough, but only they can discern by applying a moral rule to the facts that a given act ought or should not be performed. The moral restraints imposed by humans on themselves are thus highly abstract and are often in conflict with the self-interest of the agent. So he says, whatever abilities that animals do have that are somewhat tracking with human capacities that make us special, they still don't have the one very special ability of free moral judgment and moral self-governance. So lacking that capacity, they're not in the moral community, and never fear that what we do to them is wrong, because whether it kills them, hurts them, or subjects them to any other type of suffering, it's okay, because these are not things that have rights, because they lack those essential qualities that the author's talking about. So then he kind of makes a bold statement in one of the latter stages of his paper. Remember how we talked about the concept of speciesism, where it's like unequal treatment of another being, even though they have the same interest as you, only because they have a different species than you. Singer thought that was wrong. He thought, if you care about human pain, but you don't have the same level of concern for animal pain, that's not really morally acceptable, because you're giving unequal consideration to the exact same interest across the two beings, only because they're of a different species. But now Cohen enters the frame, and he says, you know what? He takes up the label. He just proudly adopts the term. He says, I am a speciesist. So he talks about defending speciesism. So you might think, well, it's wrong to prioritize your similar interests over the similar interests of the animals only on the basis of a different species. But he says that's not necessarily wrong at all, because the difference of species is a morally relevant difference. Now, racism and sexism that are being compared with speciesism, he rejects the analogy between them. Because if I don't treat you the same just because you're a human being with a different gender than me, or you're a human being with a different race than me, that's wrong, because we're both humans and we still have the same capacities intellectually and otherwise. But if I don't treat an animal the same way I would treat a human, just because it's of a different species, the difference in race or gender between humans is morally not relevant. But the difference in species is morally relevant, as he argues, because those beings that are of different species lack the critical capacity for free moral judgment and entertaining and responding to moral claims or even making them. So he says, I am a speciesist. In other words, it is okay to prefer the interests of humans over the similar interests of animals, or to accord them a higher tier of status and value, because we're talking about a difference of species, which is a morally well-based difference, instead of just difference of skin color, eye color, whether you have two X chromosomes or an XY chromosome, gender-based differences. Those things are not morally relevant. But if one thing can engage in moral judgment and the other can't, that is a morally relevant difference. And so their interests can be accorded less weight. So just having the capacity for pain does not give the same moral status to animals as humans. That's what Cohen says, as opposed to Singer earlier. He says it's not comparable to racism, because in the case of racism, again, there's no morally relevant distinction between the two classes of beings, the one that's being given better treatment and the one that's given worse treatment. But when we talk about the two classes of beings being not just two races, but two species, there is a morally relevant difference between the two classes, and he thinks it's clear and obvious, the lack of capacity for moral judgment on the other side of that species divide. So he says we are thus justified in preferring our interests over those of the animals. And he also says, so this whole argument to this point has been kind of more Kantian in spirit from Cohen. Cohen's been arguing that beings that don't have certain rational capacities are not things that you have to treat never as a means. Like, you could treat them as a means because they lack reason, they lack moral judgment, they lack the ability to make moral claims. So that much sounds kind of Kantian. If you lack a certain kind of status, we don't have duties to you of any sort. But then he does try to slide into like a little bit of a utilitarian mode for a bit, because he starts to talk about the immense value and the output for overall happiness that the biomedical experiments conducted on animals have provided for us. So think of all the different medical and biomedical experiments that have been done on animals that have enabled us to develop vaccines, therapeutic treatments, prosthetic devices, surgical techniques. Those things have to be, or at least typically are, first attempted on non-human specimens to perfect the chemistry of the medicines or the surgical techniques that are being proposed, or the other biomedical innovations that are being, again, explored in application to non-human animals. And what he's saying is that's a lot of value that comes from those things. There's a lot of lives saved, there's a lot of pain reduced, there's a lot of general happiness / pleasure that those experiments result in. So he said that if we were to discontinue such experiments, yes, the animals that were exposed to the suffering would suffer less because they're not being treated that way, but that would also eliminate all the benefits on the other side of the scale that would have come from those experiments. And he thinks that the immense value of these experiments can't be minimized. So even if we're just purely utilitarians, he thinks that the overwhelming amount of happiness, pleasure, utilitarian value that comes from using animals justifies on strictly utilitarian grounds the use of these animals in experiments. Let me read you then his words on both of those points. He says, so he says, he quotes Singer talking about speciesism when Singer said, the racist violates the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of members of his own race when there's a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. The sexist violates the principle of equality by favoring the interests of his own sex. Similarly, the speciesist allows the interest of his own species to override the greater interests of members of other species. Now he says this argument is worse than unsound, it is atrocious. So he really gets into some rhetoric. Cohen says, this makes an offensive moral conclusion from a deliberately devised verbal parallelism that is utterly wrong. Racism has no rational justification whatsoever. Differing degrees of respect or concern for humans for no other reason than that they are members of different races is an injustice totally without foundation. Racists, even if acting on the basis of mistaken factual beliefs, do grave moral wrong precisely because there is no morally relevant distinction among the races. The assumption of such differences has led to outright horrors, slavery, segregation, etc. The same is true of the sexes, neither sex being entitled by right to greater respect or concern than the other. Between species of animal life, however, between, for example, humans on the one hand and cats or rats on the other, the morally relevant differences are enormous and almost universally appreciated. Humans engage in moral reflection, humans are morally self-governing, humans are members of moral communities, recognizing just claims against their own interests. Human beings do have rights. Theirs is a moral status very different from those of cats or rats. So he then says boldly, I am a speciesist. Speciesism is not just plausible, it's essential, because those who will not make the morally relevant distinctions among species are almost certain, in consequence, to misapprehend their true obligations. The comparison between speciesism and racism is insidious. Every sensitive moral judgment requires that the differing natures of the beings to whom obligations are owed be considered. If all forms of animal life must be treated equally, and if therefore in evaluating a research program the pains of a rodent count equally with the pains of a human, we would be forced to conclude that neither humans nor rodents possess rights, or that rodents possess all the rights that humans possess. But both of these are absurd statements. And then talking about the utilitarian piece of his argument, where he really regards the value of the animal experiments highly in comparison to the pain they suffer from it. He says here, those who claim to base their objection to the use of animals in biomedical research on their reckoning of the net pleasures and pains produced make a second error equally grave. Even if it were true, as it surely isn't, that the pains of all animals must be counted equally, a good utilitarian calculation requires that we weigh all the consequences of the use of animals in laboratory research. Critics relying on animal rights may claim to ignore the beneficial results of such research, rights being trump cards to which interest and advantage must give way. But an argument that is explicitly framed in terms of interest and benefit for all over the long run must attend also to the disadvantageous consequences of not using animals in research and to all the achievements attained and attainable only through their use. The sum of the benefits of their use is utterly beyond quantification. So again, he's not talking about animals being used just for your barbecue or whatever that are tasty. He's talking about animals used in biomedical experiments where he thinks that there is significant and substantial value that comes from the results of those experiments. So he says the elimination of horrible diseases, the increase of longevity, the avoidance of great pain, the saving of lives, and the improvement of the quality of life for humans and animals, which is achieved through the research using animals, is so incalculably great that the argument of these critics systematically pursued establishes not their conclusion, but its reverse. To refrain from using animals in biomedical research on a utilitarian ground is wrong. So when balancing the pleasures and pains resulting from the use of animals in research, we must not fail to place on the scales the terrible pains that would have resulted, would be suffered now, and would long continue had animals not been used. Every disease that was eliminated, every vaccine that was developed, every method of pain relief created, every surgical procedure invented, every prosthetic device implanted, indeed, virtually every modern medical therapy is due in part or in whole to experimentation using animals. So, therefore, we see the full scope of Cohen's argument that animals may be used in these experiments because, first off, they don't have rights because they don't have the capacity to make, respond to, or to self-legislate moral claims like humans can do and do in fact do. But he also says that even apart from their not having rights, there's an incalculably vast amount of total happiness and pleasure that's the consequence of using them in these biomedical experiments. Now, remember earlier when we read the Singer talked briefly about biomedical experiments done on animals, and he thought they can't be morally justified because, as he presented it, the experiments are of dubious value. They're for additional product lines of already existing products, just to kind of tweak the formula to create like a new and improved version of an existing, I don't know, food coloring or hair dye or, something like that. He says we already have enough products like that, so it's just kind of unnecessary to expose new animals to brutal suffering and pain in medical experiments just for the sake of getting these unnecessary additional consumer goods. But Cohen has a much more positive estimation of the total value, not just in the past, but continuing on into the future of such biomedical experiments. So it kind of in a way between Singer and Cohen, the utilitarian part of their argument, it would depend on the total net value in terms of overall happiness that the experiments generate when compared against the significant pain and suffering that the animals endure through that. Cohen's view is that even if we take the animal suffering into account, the value of the experiments done on them strongly outweighs their suffering and pain, so much so that there would be less yield of net utility if we were to desist from such experiments and thus eliminate all the positive benefits that come from doing them. Whereas Singer had thought that if we stop these experiments, all we would be doing is eliminating a lot of animal pain and suffering, and it wouldn't even really diminish very much the total utility to humans. So that's kind of almost like a fact-based disagreement between them. How much total benefit comes from continuing biomedical experiments on animals? Finally, at the end, Cohen talks about how some might say, let's just substitute the animals for humans that could consent to the risks involved in the experiments. But he finds that to be just a non-starter. Humans, of course, as he's argued earlier in the paper, have rights, and to put them in positions where similar types of harms could be imposed on them would be to violate the rights of certain, humans. He also says that there's no realistic way to achieve the same theoretical outcomes, or experimental outcomes, I should say, by using simulations like sophisticated computer simulations or something. We need to have real test subjects to see how certain things interact with a living system before they can be put out there for commercial or biomedical use. So that's how he rests his case. Now, there's one more author that's listed for today, and that's Immanuel Kant. So now we're going back to Kant. Immanuel Kant. This is actually quite a crucial to your paper writing task, because it says there that you have to explain both the Kantian and the utilitarian view on animals, how the Kantian view is generally anti-animal, and how the utilitarian view, as was just described, whether you're Singer or Cohen, you could spin it in either direction depending on your estimation of like the total value of animal use compared to the pain the animals suffer. But Kant, he's got his own view on this, and it's pretty specific. There's a very short passage in the book on him, and it's just taken from one of his other writings. It's called Our Duties to Animals. So this is Our Duties to Animals by Kant. Just listing it off to the side there between the divider. So, our duties to animals. Ready for this? Kant says we don't have duties to animals. We have no, at least, direct duties to animals. And the reason that he gives why we don't have duties to animals is going to recall to your mind the argument just provided by Cohen. In fact, Cohen, of course, he comes much later in time. Kant lived back in the 1700s, so this is kind of a person maybe influenced in part by the ideas of Kant and other authors that have expressed similar arguments. But Kant says we do not have duties to animals, and the reason is straightforward. He says because they lack reason, because they lack moral self-awareness. And since they're lacking in reason and moral autonomy, they can be used as a means to an end. Contrary to what he says as he applies the categorical imperative to other fellow human beings. To another human, it's not okay for me to like exploit, manipulate, or use them in a way that benefits me at their expense. That's using them just as a thing to be manipulated or exploited. That's using them as a means. But he says that's not the same with animals. Animals can and ought to be used as a means for the sake of mankind because, again, they're not rational. They lack reason. They lack moral self-governance. So don't worry about using them as a means to whatever end, whether it's food, biomedical experiments, clothing, or what have you, or I don't know, hunting even. But he does want to, let me read though that part to get that part clear to you. So on page 595, here's what Kant said. As far as animals are concerned, we have no direct duties. Animals are not self-conscious and are there merely as a means to an end. That end is man. We could ask, why do animals exist? But to ask, why does man exist is a ridiculous question. Our duties towards animals are merely indirect duties to humanity. But there is this subtlety, so now we have to point out a subtlety in Kant's argument. He talks about there's two types of duties, okay? So two types of duties. So one, indirect duties. And then the other type, direct duties. Now, Kant argues that, so just kind of getting the points out there that I just mentioned verbally. There's two types of duties. They're direct duties, they're indirect duties. Kant says that we do not have direct duties to animals because, as I just said, they lack reason and they lack the ability for moral self-awareness. Sorry for the typo, it should be the letter F to show self-awareness. So animals don't reason, they don't invent systems of accountability to the moral law, they don't understand the categorical imperative. So in that way, he thinks that they are not things that we owe duties towards, or at least not direct duties. But there's also these indirect duties, and that he does say we have some towards the animals. So he says we do, however, have indirect duties to the animals. To not be unnecessarily cruel to them. Because if we do indulge in needless cruelty to the animals, this could cause us to eventually be cruel to human beings. Okay, so just exploring the point that he's making. Kant says we don't have any direct duties to animals because they lack reason and the moral self-awareness that was mentioned, but he does concede this much at least, that we have indirect duties to the animals, to not be unnecessarily cruel to them. The reason that he thinks we have these indirect duties is because he thinks that if we were to just be kind of abusive, cruel, mean-spirited to animals for no valid reason, then that would kind of start to create a habit within our character that would ultimately, inevitably expose itself when we deal with other humans in that way. So basically, like if you're gonna like abuse a dog, cat, or other animal, pig, cow, horse, and you got no reason for that, you're just doing it for no reason at all, he thinks that that's going to probably instill within you a brutality towards living things generally, including humans. And he says you don't actually have any direct duties to the animals because they just can't engage in moral self-reflection or rationality. But you do have duties to other humans for sure. He says you're not allowed to ever treat a human as a means to an end. So it's almost like he's saying you got to sort of protect your gentle feelings and sensibilities towards humans by not indulging in excessive or unnecessary cruel behavior towards the animals. So he has this example that he gives, like, suppose someone has owned a dog and it's used for hunting. They use this dog to help them assist in hunting. But now the dog's become too old to help anymore. It's old, it's slow, and it can't really function to serve the master through the hunting process no more. Well, Kant says when that happens, what ought to be done is that you don't just summarily kill it because it's outlived its utility to you, but that you continue to care for it until the end of its natural lifespan. But why do that? He says it's not for the sake of the animal, because you have no duties to it. You have no obligations directly to it. Why then do you think he says that you should not terminate the animal's existence the moment that it becomes less than fully practically valuable to you? Because if you did that, you would again stimulate and reinforce vicious and harsh tendencies that might expose themselves in your dealings with other humans. Don't even take my word for it. Here's Kant saying this, okay? So on page 595 of our book, he says, our duties towards animals are merely indirect duties towards humanity. Animal nature has some comparisons to human nature, and by doing our duties to animals in respect of manifestations which correspond to manifestations of human nature, we indirectly do our duty towards humanity. So he gives this example. If a dog has served his master long and faithfully, his service on the comparison of human service deserves a reward, and when the dog has grown too old to serve, his master ought to keep him until he dies. Such an action helps to support us in our duties towards human beings, where they are official duties. If then any acts of animals are comparable to human actions and arise from the same principles, we have duties towards the animals because we thus cultivate the corresponding duties towards human beings. If a man shoots his dog because the animal is no longer capable of service, he does not fail in his duty to the dog because the dog cannot judge. But his act is inhuman and damages in himself the humanity which it is his duty to show towards mankind. So if he is not to stifle his human feelings, he must practice kindness towards animals, because he who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with men. That makes sense to you guys a little bit? Just checking in here in the chat. You understand Kant's position? I find that Kant's position is actually quite compatible with a common sense view that a lot of everyday people have, which is, okay, I'm not going to not eat meat. I'm not going to stop using leather or fur or whatever, dairy or eggs, because I just don't see these animals as having the same standing as a human. But I'm not going to tolerate, subject to, or condone cruelty to the animals, because if it's cruelty, it's going to make you a cruel person, period. And that's not going to be something that you could just confine to your treatment of animals, but it's something that you'll ultimately spill over into the way you interact with humans. So it's kind of like, for the sake of other human beings, you should practice kindness on the animals. Do you owe anything to these animals directly? No, because they're outside the moral community. But since they are at least capable of feeling things, and they remind us sometimes of our other human race, we should at least not indulge in unnecessary cruelty to them. Kant's argument is compatible with using animals for meat, using them in experiments, as long as what is done doesn't subject them to unnecessary harm or suffering. Like if they were painlessly euthanized or slaughtered, the use that we make of them is fair game. But it's, again, the cruelty that he's trying to tell us to warn ourselves away from. Because if you just engage in a persistent pattern of cruelty to the animals, it's ultimately, he thinks, inevitably going to be shown in the way you interact with humans. Santino, you say, so just be good to them, but don't protect them. I mean, your word protect, I would have to ask, I guess, maybe what do you mean exactly by it? But generally, I think you're on the right track. What he's saying is you have no direct duties to them, but if you're kind and not cruel to them, that's probably going to protect your own character as you then go forward in dealing and interacting with your fellow humans. So it's really all for the sake of humans that we owe at least some indirect duties to the animals. Not for their sake, but for the sake of humans that would be harmed, perhaps, if you didn't treat the animals in a way that was kind. It reminds me of something. So he makes another point that I was thinking in connection with, so having known about some of the pasts of certain serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer and others, some of these people, Dahmer in particular, thinking of him as an example, they started their pattern of homicidal behavior early in childhood by torturing animals. So Dahmer famously, talked about that, how he had a desire to hurt these animals, and he did. And then that kind of desensitized him to subjecting other living things to pain and suffering, or even killing them. So then as an adult, he becomes this murderer that commits all these gruesome crimes against other humans. But it seems to be somewhat fostered by or facilitated by the earlier abusive behavior directed at the animals. And Kant makes a similar example in his own writing here. He says, we can judge the heart of a man by the way he treats animals. He mentions an artist that lived during his time, not an important name, but the name was Hogarth. He says, Hogarth depicts this in his engravings. He shows how cruelty grows and develops. He shows the child's cruelty to animals, pinching the tail of a dog or cat. He then depicts the grown man in his carriage running over a child, and then the culmination of cruelty in murder. He thus brings home to us in a terrible fashion the rewards of cruelty, and this should be an impressive lesson to children. The more we come in contact with animals and observe their behavior, the more we love them, because we see how great they care for their own young. It's difficult for us to then be cruel even in thought to a wolf. Leibniz used a tiny worm for purposes of observation, and then carefully replaced it with the leaf on the tree so that it would not come to harm through any action of his. He would have been sorry, a natural feeling for a humane man, to destroy such a creature for no reason. And here's one of those, I think, powerful quotes, and that really summarizes his whole view. He says, tender feelings towards dumb animals develop humane feelings towards mankind. He makes another interesting observation next. At the time that he lived, there was a rule in England that if you worked as a butcher or a medical doctor, that you were not allowed to sit on a jury, because they thought you become so desensitized to death and so on that you might not be able to make the proper moral judgment as to the facts of the case. So if you're sitting on a murder trial and you're slaughtering animals all day, you might not think too much about how bad it is for people or things to be killed. So he says, in England, butchers and doctors don't sit on a jury because they are accustomed to the sight of death, and therefore they become hardened to it. Vivisectionists, people that did animal experiments in his time, who use living animals for their experiments, do act cruelly, but their aim is praiseworthy, and they can justify their cruelty since animals must be regarded as man's instruments. But any cruelty for just sport cannot be justified. So for Kant, to kind of justify cruel treatment to animals, there has to be an important enough human benefit lying on the other side of it. It can't just be, I'm doing this for the pleasure of the hunt. So if it's for food, if it's for biomedical knowledge or treatments, clothing, whatever, then in those cases, the reason and the value for the sake of the animal suffering vindicates the case of them suffering. But doing it for no valid reason, for just sport